Hey guys, tonight I want to start with a bottle. It's a small bottle of Valentine's meat juice, beef extract basically, a Victorian health tonic, the kind of thing you gave an invalid in 1889, the way you'd hand somebody a sports drink today. This particular bottle sat on a washstand in a sick room in Liverpool, England, in the second week of May, 1889, a few feet from a dying man. Inside that bottle, an analyst later found half a grain of arsenic, half a grain, about 30 milligrams, roughly a third of what the textbooks of the day called a reliably fatal dose. The dying man never drank from it. Nobody disputes that. The nurse took the bottle away before it ever touched his lips, and the prosecution never claimed otherwise. Half a grain of arsenic, in a bottle no one drank, on a washstand, in a house that was about to become the most famous address in England. That bottle put a 26-year-old American woman in a death cell. Her name was Florence Maybrick. She was from Mobile, Alabama. She had a soft southern voice, 2 small children, and a husband 23 years older than her. On the 7th of August, 1889, an English judge put a square of black cloth on his head and told her she would be hanged by the neck until dead for murdering that husband with arsenic. Here is the problem. Here is the thing that has kept this case open for 137 years, long after everyone in it was buried. Her husband ate arsenic, not once, not accidentally. James Maybrick dosed himself with arsenic and strychnine for years, on purpose, the way other men took whiskey. Chemists testified to it. Friends testified to it. He took it in his food, he took it in his tonics, he bragged about it. When he finally died, at 50, after 2 weeks of agony, the analysts went through his body, looking for the poison that killed him. In a grown man, a fatal load. That's what they expected. What they found, in total, was a fraction of a fatal dose. Less arsenic than the amount sitting in that undrunk bottle on the washstand. So tonight there are 2 poisons in this story, and I need you to keep your eye on the difference, because the whole case lives inside it. There is the arsenic, which was real and weighed and measured in fractions of a grain. That poison was everywhere in this story except, apparently, in sufficient quantity to kill anyone. Then there is the second poison, the one nobody weighed, the one that was administered to a courtroom over 7 days in August by a dying judge, swallowed whole by 12 men, and never, ever purged from the record. Because here's the part I find hard to sit with. Even after all the reading, the verdict against Florence Maybrick has never been overturned. Not in 1889. Not when the judge who sentenced her lost his mind. Not when the American government leaned on the British Empire for 15 years. Not when she walked out of prison. Not when she died, decades later, an ocean away, under a different name, in a cottage full of cats, with her secret intact and schoolboys mowing her lawn. There is a grave in Connecticut, on the grounds of a boys' school, and the woman in it is still, in the eyes of English law, a convicted murderer. We're going to walk this whole road tonight. The 6-day ocean crossing, where a 17-year-old girl met the wrong man. The grand house on the Mersey, that was rotting quietly from the inside. The flypapers soaking in a basin. The letter a nanny decided to open. The 7 days in St. George's Hall that stopped being a murder trial somewhere in the middle and turned into something older and uglier. The piece of paper that saved her life while managing, at the same time, to convict her of a second crime she was never tried for. That paper is the strangest document in this entire story, and when we get to it, I want you to read it the way a lawyer would, because its logic should not be possible in a court system that respects itself. And at the very end, that cottage in Connecticut. What the people around her knew, what they found when she died, what it tells you that the only court that ever set Florence Maybrick free was time. This is not a video about whether Florence Maybrick was a good wife. She wasn't, by the standards of her day, and honestly the record on that is not kind by the standards of ours either. She lied when it suited her. She had an affair and handled it recklessly. If the charge that August had been adultery, the verdict would have been fair. The charge was murder. The evidence for murder is the thing we are going to weigh tonight, the way the jury was supposed to. All of it, including the parts that were buried under 2 days of a failing judge's morality lecture, and the parts that only surfaced when it was years too late to matter. Get comfortable. This one starts on the open Atlantic. The ship was called the Baltic, and in the spring of 1880, she was 6 days of floating small talk between New York and Liverpool. 6 days is a dangerous amount of time. Long enough to fall for somebody. Short enough that you're falling for the performance, not the person. Every historian who has written about what happened on that crossing ends up saying some version of the same thing. 2 performances met in the middle of the Atlantic, and each one bought the other completely. Florence Elizabeth Chandler was 17. She went by Flory. She was small, fair-haired, with the kind of manners that get called charming in ballrooms and naive in courtrooms. She was traveling with her mother, and her mother is a story all by herself. Caroline was a Mobile, Alabama belle who had buried one husband, divorced questions around a second, and was now on her third, a German cavalry officer, which made her the Baroness von Roques. 3 husbands, 3 fortunes, none of them quite surviving contact with her. She moved through European society, trailing rumors the way other women trailed perfume. She had raised Flory in hotel rooms and rented villas across half of Europe, which gave the girl polish, languages, and no fixed idea of what a stable marriage actually looked like up close. Flory's father had been a partner in a mobile banking house. He died before she was old enough to remember him properly, and the money he left had a way of being spoken about more than seen. That detail matters. Hold it loosely for now. A girl raised amid the scenery of wealth, without the substance of it, learns to read a room for security the way a sailor reads weather. Across the deck of the Baltic stood James Maybrick, and to a girl of 17, he must have looked like security in a wool coat. 41 years old. A Liverpool cotton broker with an office in the Knowsley buildings, and another operation in Norfolk, Virginia, because in those days the cotton trade ran on men who worked both sides of the Atlantic. He was heavy-set, confident, generous with money in public. He'd survived a bout of malaria in America a few years back, people said, and carried a certain invalid's vanity about his health. He talked about his constitution, the way some men talk about their horses. The courtship took roughly the length of the crossing. By the time the Baltic tied up at Liverpool, the 41-year-old broker and the 17-year-old girl had an understanding. They were married the following year, in July of 1881, and not quietly either. St. James's Church, Piccadilly, London, a society wedding for a Southern belle and a rising man of the Liverpool Cotton Exchange. 23 years between them. The Victorians didn't blink at that. It was practically a business model. An older man of established means, a young wife to run his house and raise his children. Everyone's position improved. That was the theory printed on the label. What was actually inside the marriage took a few years to reveal itself. And it revealed itself the way these things usually do. Money first. Because James Maybrick was not rich. He was a man doing an impression of rich, in a city that ran on the impression. Liverpool in the 1880s was the cotton capital of Europe, a place where fortunes got made and unmade, between lunch and dinner, on the movement of prices in fields 4,000 miles away. A broker like James lived on margins and nerve. Some years were good. The bad years didn't change the lifestyle, because in his world, looking reduced was the same as being finished. So the household ran on appearances, and the appearances ran on credit. There's a number that survives from inside that marriage, and it's the first number tonight you can really feel. In the last years, at the grand house we'll walk into shortly, James gave Flory £7 a week to run the entire household. Servants' wages, food, coal, the table a cotton broker's wife was expected to set. £7. Respectable money for a clerk's family in a terrace house. For a mansion with live-in staff and a carriage, and a husband who brought business guests home. It was a costume budget. The record shows what she did about the gap, because the record is full of it. Borrowed sums. Quiet arrangements with moneylenders at interest that would make your eyes water. Bills moved from one drawer to another. She hid the debts from him. He hid the state of the business from her. Two people keeping the same secret from each other, in the same house, in matching handwriting. And the girl who'd been raised to read rooms for security had, by her mid-20s, worked out the truth every gambler's family learns eventually. There wasn't any. The Baltic had sold each of them a story. She thought she'd married a fortune. He thought he'd married one too, the banker's daughter with the Baroness mother. They were both wrong, and they found it out slowly, in an enormous house, together and completely alone. That house deserves its own introduction, because it becomes a character in this story. More than a character, honestly. A crime scene, a courtroom exhibit, and a kind of trap. Battlecrease House still stands in Aigburth, a comfortable suburb south of Liverpool, looking out toward the cricket ground. In 1888, when the Maybricks moved in, it was 20 rooms of high Victorian statement, bay windows, a staircase built for descending slowly in a good dress, gardens, a paddock, a greenhouse. The rent alone said things about James Maybrick that his bank balance could not back up. Step inside for a minute, because the texture of this house is the texture of the case. Gas brackets hissing in the evening, heavy furniture bought to be inherited, a nursery floor above, where 2 small children lived under the care of a nanny named Alice Yap. Remember that name. Servants below, 5 of them, in a hierarchy as rigid as anything upstairs. A cook, housemaids, the nanny, and every one of them watching, because that is the thing about a Victorian household nobody tells you in the costume dramas. The people carrying the trays see everything. The staff of Battlecrease House will end up in a witness box, nearly all of them, describing the private habits of the 2 people who paid their wages. James had his own dressing room, and in it, his own private pharmacy. This is documented to the point of comedy. The man collected medicines the way his wife was accused of collecting debts. Tonics, powders, pills, prescriptions from multiple doctors who didn't know about each other, patent remedies from 2 continents. Witnesses would later count the bottles in that house by the dozen. He had a doctor in London, doctors in Liverpool, a chemist in Norfolk, Virginia, and an opinion of his own medical genius that none of them could dent. He dosed himself for his liver, for his nerves, for his digestion, for the vague traveling complaints of a man who had decided at 40 that his body was a failing investment. We'll open that medicine habit fully in a few minutes, because it's the floor the whole case stands on. But first you need to know what else James Maybrick kept, besides medicines. Because the respectable broker of Battlecrease House maintained a second establishment, and a second family, and he had done so since before Florrie ever saw the deck of the Baltic. Her name was Sarah Ann Robertson. She lived in the south of England, moved between addresses, and was known in some of them as Mrs. Maybrick. The relationship went back roughly 2 decades. It had produced children. How many is genuinely disputed. The family accounts and later research disagree. Some say 3, some say 5, and the record is thin in the way records about inconvenient women usually are. What is not disputed by anyone serious is that she existed, that the connection continued into the marriage, and that money which could not stretch to the housekeeping at Battlecrease was stretching, somehow, to the south of England. Now put yourself, for 1 minute, in a specific pair of shoes. You're Florrie Maybrick, sometime around 1887. You are 25 years old, 6 years married, 4,000 miles from Mobile. You have 2 children upstairs. You are juggling moneylenders to keep a 20-room house running on £7 a week, and you have just learned, in the way wives learn things, a letter, a slip, a kindness from someone who enjoyed delivering it, that the marriage you are bankrupting yourself to decorate has been double-booked since before it began. You can't divorce him. Understand what that meant in 1887. A husband could divorce a wife for adultery. Full stop. A wife needed adultery plus cruelty, or desertion, proved in open court, at a cost in money and reputation that would burn her alive socially either way. And the children, in the ordinary run of things, went to the father. The door marked exit was painted on the wall. The books about this case spend their pages on arsenic, and fair enough. But if you want the actual temperature of Battlecrease House in the last year before it became famous, it isn't in the Flypapers. It's here. 2 people, bound together by law and appearances, each sitting on a stack of secrets, hers financial, his chemical and romantic, in 20 rooms of borrowed grandeur, being watched by 5 servants through every meal. The gas hisses, the children sleep, the bills sit in the drawer. Nobody in that house needed poison for it to be dangerous. It was armed when they moved in. Before the poison, meet the family, because the family is the mechanism of everything that happens in May. There were 5 Maybrick brothers, sons of a Liverpool engraver, a family that had climbed hard into respectability and gripped it with both hands. James was the second and, in his own telling, the flagship, the transatlantic man of business. Below him, in varying states of usefulness, came William and Thomas, who will stay in the background of our story, and 2 brothers who will not. Edwin first, the youngest, easy company, unmarried, junior partner in James's cotton firm. Edwin was a fixture at Battlecrease, staying for weeks at a stretch, squiring Florrie to concerts when James couldn't be bothered, which was often. The household gossip, then and forever after, wondered aloud whether Edwin's attentions to his young sister-in-law stayed strictly brotherly. I'll leave that where the evidence leaves it, in the wondering. What matters is proximity. When the crisis comes, Edwin is already inside the walls. Then Michael. Michael Maybrick requires a real introduction, because when this case explodes, the public was as fascinated to find him in it as you'd be to find a beloved singer in a modern scandal. Michael had left Liverpool, trained as a musician, and become, under the stage name Stephen Adams, one of the most successful songwriters of the entire Victorian era. A tall, imposing baritone who performed his own material to packed halls and sold sheet music by the 100,000. Nancy Lee, The Midshipmite, a ballad called They All Love Jack. Songs the whole empire could hum, and remember that last title, because history has a sense of humor we'll meet again near the end. Michael moved in London clubland, dined well, organized, presided. He was the family's real flagship. Whatever James told himself, and he treated the Battlecrease marriage from the start the way you'd treat a bad investment a sibling won't exit. He thought Florrie extravagant, suspect, foreign in every sense. There was no warmth to lose between them, and when the moment came, none was wasted. 5 brothers, a firm, a fortune in sheet music, a wall of Liverpool respectability. Now hold that wall up against what the respectable flagship was actually doing with his weeks and his money. Because we know, and the brothers at least partly knew, and the knowing changes the temperature of that house. Her name, as I said, was Sarah Ann Robertson, and she was not a fling. The connection reached back to James's London days, some 20 years, well before Florrie existed in his world. Sarah kept his household in all but law. At various addresses across the years, she was known to neighbors and, on at least one document that survives, described as his wife. There were children, and here the record does what Victorian records always do with women like Sarah. It goes vague and mumbles. Family tradition and later researchers put the number as high as 5. Not one was acknowledged in any will or public act. They existed in the ledger the age kept for such arrangements, the invisible one. Think about the mechanics of it, practically. A man complaining about 7 pounds a week of housekeeping and egg birth was running, at whatever reduced scale, a second establishment 3 hours south. Money left this story constantly through a door Florrie couldn't see for years. When she finally did see it, sometime in the middle 1880s, by an account she gave later, she was carrying her second child. Whatever remained of the marriage's original story died in that discovery. What replaced it was the arrangement you already know: separate rooms, public performances, private ledgers. One more turn of the screw, and it's the one I find genuinely bleak. By the standards of his own world, James had done nothing unusual. A mistress, discreetly kept, was practically a line item for a man of his position. The age had a shrug ready for it. The same age was about to try his wife for her character. In a courtroom, before the whole world, and no one in scarlet robes would ever suggest that his 20 years of Sarah Ann Robertson made his word, his habits, or his household less respectable. Her 3 days in a London hotel would be motive for murder. His 2 decades were just Tuesday. Keep both of those in the scales tonight. The court only ever weighed one. The brothers knew their brother, is the point. They knew the finances were theater and the marriage was ash, which is what makes their behavior in May 1889 so interesting and so fast. When the whisper of poison finally rose in that house, Michael and Edwin did not pause on the 20 years of secrets they knew firsthand. The suspicion went one direction, instantly, totally, and it never once looked back. Now for the floor this whole case stands on. James Maybrick's habit. I want to be careful here, because this is the part of the story where a lazy telling slides into caricature. The mustached Victorian gulping poison for fun. The truth is stranger and better documented than the caricature, and it starts, of all places, in Virginia. In the 1870s, James spent long stretches in Norfolk, Virginia, buying cotton. Somewhere in those years he came down with malaria, the standing plague of every port town on that coast. The treatments of the day leaned on quinine, and alongside it, on preparations of arsenic. That was not quackery, or not entirely. Arsenic sat in the official pharmacopoeia. Doctors prescribed Fowler's solution, a licensed arsenic tonic, for skin, for nerves, for fevers, for fatigue. The dose made the poison, they said, and in small doses, arsenic delivers a very real, very seductive effect. A flush in the cheeks, an appetite, a feeling of engine room vigor that a tired, hypochondriac businessman would notice immediately and want again. James noticed. James wanted it again, for the rest of his life. A Norfolk drug clerk who knew him in those years would later swear James came into the store regularly for arsenic doses, and grumbled when he missed them, the way a man grumbles about missing coffee. Back in Liverpool, a chemist named Edward Heaton testified that for years he had mixed James his pick-me-ups several times a day some weeks, and that the recipe included liquor arsenicalis, arsenic in solution. James liked to double the dose. Friends from the exchange told stories, later under oath, about James dosing himself with strychnine too, and about the little ritual boast that went with it. He liked to tell people that what he took would kill them. Sit with the shape of that for a second, because the shape is the story. Arsenic, taken chronically, builds tolerance. The habitual user walks around, carrying and functioning on quantities that would drop a first-timer. The Victorians knew this. Their medical journals wrote up the famous arsenic eaters of Styria, Austrian peasants who took visible lumps of the stuff with breakfast and lived to advanced, rosy-cheeked old age. Which means the man at the center of this case was, by the testimony of chemists on 2 continents, precisely the kind of person whose body you could not read like an ordinary body. A fraction of a grain inside James Maybrick meant something entirely different than the same measure inside you, his doctors, and he kept a rotating cast of them. Mostly did not know about each other, and none of them held the full inventory. His brothers had pieces. His wife had pieces. The chemists of 2 port cities had pieces. The only complete map of what went into James Maybrick in any given week existed inside James Maybrick, and he wasn't sharing it with anybody, least of all his physicians. So that's the man. A cotton broker with a costume fortune, a secret family, a body chemically retuned by 2 decades of self-dosing, and a famous brother with a low opinion of his marriage. In April of 1889, that man had almost exactly 1 month to live. The medicine cabinet was full. The house was watching. All the case needed now was a spark, and the spark had already happened, 1 month earlier, at a hotel in London. Rewind to March 1889, 8 weeks before James Maybrick dies. The marriage, by this point, is over everywhere except on paper and at dinner parties. They keep separate rooms. There have been scenes about money, scenes about the other establishment in the South, and at some point in this period, by Florrie's later account, a physical fight that left marks. The household staff will testify to raised voices and a black eye. Whatever the precise choreography, Battlecrease in early 1889 is 2 flags flying over one Cold War. Enter Alfred Brierly, another cotton man, of course. In Liverpool in the 80s, you could not throw a bread roll without hitting one. Younger than James, unmarried, good-looking in the era's brushed and buttoned way, a regular guest at the Maybricks' table. What developed between him and Florrie developed the way it always does in these households, in plain sight of the servants and invisible to the husband. In the 3rd week of March, Florrie told her household she was going to London to visit an ailing aunt. What she actually did was book rooms at Flatman's Hotel, a discreet establishment near Cavendish Square, reserving them for a married couple. She and Brierly stayed there together for the better part of a week. I'm not going to spend 20 minutes wringing hands over this, and I'd ask the 19th century to extend the same courtesy, which it will not. Two things about that week matter for the case. First, it happened. She never denied it, and it handed the Crown its motive on embossed hotel stationery. Second, and this is the detail people miss, it went badly. Whatever Florrie hoped that week would be, the surviving accounts agree it curdled. There are hints Brierly's attention was already wandering, hints of an awkward, deflating conversation, and she came home not liberated, but frightened, tangled in one more secret she couldn't afford. 8 days later, the whole mess went public in the most Liverpool way imaginable, at the races, the Grand National, Aintree, the 29th of March, 1889. The entire city out in its best coats, the Prince of Wales in attendance. Florrie went to the course in a party that included both her husband and Alfred Brierly, which tells you something about the nerve of everyone involved, and at some point, she walked the course openly on Brierly's arm, in front of half of Liverpool society. James saw it, or was told about it, loudly, by people who enjoyed telling him. What happened when they got home that evening was reconstructed later in a courtroom from the household's testimony. A raging quarrel, James tearing at her dress, a blow or blows, the black eye the servants described, him shouting about the will, about turning her out of the house. Florrie, the next morning, with visible bruising, going to the family doctor, and, in the same stretch of days, consulting about a separation. The doctor and others talked her down, in the way the machinery of respectability always talked wives down. Think of the children, think of the scandal. It will pass. Here is where I have to stop and show you the clock, because from this point forward the clock is the whole argument. The Aintree quarrel is the 30th of March, give or take a day. James Maybrick will fall ill on the 27th of April and die on the 11th of May. Every single thing Florrie Maybrick does in April 1889, every purchase, every letter, every kindness at a sickbed, is about to be read backward through his death and forward from that quarrel. That is the corridor she is walking down, and she cannot see the walls. She can see her own problems. A marriage at knife point. A lover going cool who she is still writing to. Debts stacked so high that around this same time she pawns jewelry and takes out yet another loan against her mother's expectations. A husband whose health, always his favorite subject, is getting genuinely noisier. More pills, more tonics, more complaints about his head and his hands. And somewhere in the back pages of her mind, or so she will swear for the rest of her life, a beauty routine she learned as a girl on the continent, for her complexion, before a ball season where she expected to be looked at very closely. Which brings us to the chemist's shop, and the single most famous domestic purchase in the history of English crime. To understand what happens at that chemist's counter, you have to understand something modern people find almost impossible to believe. In 1889, arsenic wasn't lurking at the edge of ordinary life. It was ordinary life. Walk through a respectable Victorian home of that decade and count with me. The wallpaper, if it glowed that fashionable deep green, very possibly held arsenic in the pigment. And the medical journals had spent 30 years printing alarms about children sickening in freshly papered nurseries. Arsenic greens colored dress fabric, artificial flowers, candles, even confectionery dyes. And every few years some horror got into the papers, and Parliament clucked, and very little changed. The pharmacist sold Fowler's solution over the counter, arsenic as a licensed tonic, prescribed for skin and nerves and whatever else ailed the century. The farmer bought it by the pound for sheep dip and rat bait. Parliament had passed an Arsenic Act back in 1851, after a run of notorious poisonings, requiring retail white arsenic to be mixed with soot or indigo so it couldn't pass as flour or sugar, and requiring the buyer's name in a register. That was the safeguard. A signature and some soot, guarding a substance that sat in half the pantries in England anyway. The beauty trade is the part that matters most for our story, so let's be specific. Victorian women were sold arsenic as skincare, openly, relentlessly, in print. Complexion wafers, arsenical soaps, preparations promising to clear the skin and lend it that pale, luminous finish, the age worshipped, advertised in respectable papers under respectable doctors' names. The logic was the same seductive logic that hooked James Maybrick. Small doses, visible effects, the poison as tonic. Fashionable women in London, Paris, and New York genuinely ate and sponged arsenic in the name of their faces, and doctors on the continent genuinely wrote prescriptions for arsenical washes. When a woman of 1889 said the word arsenic, hanging in the air alongside rat poison and murder trials was this whole other harmless-sounding shelf, the vanity shelf. Both shelves were real. Both were within arm's reach of any housewife in Liverpool, which is why the flypaper matters so much, because the flypaper sat exactly between the shelves. A packet of arsenical flypapers cost pennies at any chemist. Hung by the window, they killed the summer flies, and nobody signed a register for them, soot rule or no soot rule, because the arsenic was bound up in the paper's coating. Soak those papers in water, though, with a little patience, and the coating lets go. The analysts in our story would later do exactly that with identical papers, in a laboratory, and coax real, weighable grains of arsenic out of an ordinary shilling purchase. Every household in England held, in effect, a slow-release poison cabinet hanging over the kitchen sink, and everybody vaguely knew it, the way everybody now vaguely knows what's under their own sink. And in Liverpool, everybody more than vaguely knew it. Liverpool knew it by name. 5 years before our story, in 1884, the city had hanged two of its own, the sisters Catherine Flanagan and Margaret Higgins, out of the crowded houses around Skirving Street. Their method had been exactly this: flypapers soaked in a basin, the water fed patiently into a healthy man, in their case for burial insurance money, and the evidence suggested he hadn't been there first. The case was enormous. Every literate person on Merseyside had followed it, shuddered at it, and stored the method away in the place where cities keep their nightmares. In Liverpool, of all the cities on earth, a basin of soaking flypapers was not a neutral object. It had a criminal record. So hold the two true stories side by side, because in the April we are standing in, both were fully, simultaneously real. A basin of flypapers meant a lady's complexion wash, improvised from the vanity shelf of a poisoned century. A basin of flypapers meant the Flanagan method, the husband killer's kitchen chemistry set. Same basin, same water, same city. Which story attached to it would depend entirely on what happened to the man of the house in the following weeks, and on who got to tell the story first. And about that second part, Florrie Maybrick was about to be catastrophically unlucky. The kettle of context is boiled. Back to the chemist shop. By mid-April, whatever else was happening inside Battlecrease House, Florrie Maybrick was buying flypapers. Not one packet, in one shop, once. That's the point the prosecution would hammer. In the second half of April, she bought flypapers twice, from two different chemists in the neighborhood, Wokes's shop and Hanson's. A dozen here, 2 dozen there. Ordinary household flypapers, the kind hanging in every larder in England that spring. Each paper carried arsenic in its coating. Soak a batch, and you could, with patience, coax out a few grains of the poison. It was the Flanagan method, or the vanity shelf, depending entirely on the eye of the beholder, and Battlecrease House was full of beholders. The servants found hers soaking. A basin in her bedroom, papers face down in water, a towel laid over the top. A housemaid saw it and thought it odd enough to mention to the others. The nanny, Alice Yap, saw it and filed it away in the drawer where Alice Yap kept things. The staff of Battlecrease, remember, had spent months watching the mistress's marriage come apart, watching the London trip, hearing the Aintree row through the walls. Now there was a basin of soaking poison papers in her room, and not one of them asked her a single question about it. They just watched and remembered. Her explanation, when the world finally demanded one, never changed. Not at the trial, not in prison, not in her memoir, not in 50 years. A face wash. Arsenic, dissolved out of the papers, mixed with lavender water and other bits, applied to the skin for her complexion. She said she'd been given such a prescription years before, as a girl in Germany, and had lost it, and was improvising the recipe from memory because there was a ball coming at the end of April and her skin had broken out. 19th century listeners laughed at that in court galleries. 21st century listeners tend to laugh too, which is funny. Because of the two audiences, we have less excuse. The Victorian beauty industry ran on arsenic. Arsenical soaps, arsenical face washes, arsenic complexion wafers, sold openly, advertised in the same newspapers that covered her trial, promising exactly what Florrie described, a clear, luminous, slightly poisoned glow. Fashionable women really did sponge diluted arsenic onto their faces. The prescription she described was the kind of thing continental doctors really did right. Her story was, at absolute minimum, culturally ordinary. The soaking method was crude, and the secrecy looked terrible. But as an explanation, it sat comfortably inside the actual habits of her actual world. Keep both possibilities alive in your head, because this is the discipline the jury was never helped to manage. A woman extracting arsenic to kill her husband, and a woman extracting arsenic because a fashion magazine culture had taught her poison was skincare, performed the identical physical actions. The basin cannot testify to intent. Everything the basin means depends on what happens next. What happened next is that James Maybrick went to the races again. Saturday, the 27th of April. The Wirral races, across the river. The weather turned foul, and James got soaked through on horseback. That morning, before setting out, he had done a characteristic James thing. He'd taken a double dose of a medicine newly arrived from London, a strychnine preparation, because he'd been feeling shaky, and his answer to shaky was always more. By evening he was ill, numb legs, sick stomach, a heaviness in his head. He rode it like a man with long practice at being ill, went to dinner at a friend's anyway, felt worse, and by Sunday he was vomiting and blaming, depending on the hour, the wedding, the brandy, or the double dose. Dr. Humphreys, the family physician, was called in on Sunday morning. Here begins the medical parade that will consume the last 2 weeks of James Maybrick's life. Humphreys examined him and heard, from James's own mouth, a partial confession of the self-dosing, the strychnine, the London medicine, the nerve tonics. The doctor prescribed, sensibly enough, stopping all of it, and a bland diet. For a few days, James wobbled between better and worse. He went into the office, he complained. He revised his symptoms hourly for anyone who would listen. On the 2nd of May, he ate at the Exchange, came home, and got worse in a way that didn't wobble back. vomiting that wouldn't quit, a raw, scalded throat, pain in his legs. From the 3rd of May onward, James Maybrick was in his bed at Battlecrease House, and he never really left it again. The household closed around the sickroom the way Victorian households did. Beef teas, sponge baths, basins. Florrie, by every account including the servants, nursing him around the clock in those first days, sleeping in snatches on a chair in his dressing room. A second doctor called in for consultation, then a hired nurse, then another. The patient rallying at noon and sinking by midnight, maddening everyone. Diagnosed with dyspepsia, then gastritis, an irritation of the stomach from some indiscretion of diet or dosing, category, vague. Nobody, and write this down somewhere in your head, nobody treating James Maybrick in the first week of his illness suspected poisoning, and the symptoms in the medical notes, taken alone, never did force that conclusion. 2 of the doctors who watched him die would say under oath that what they observed was consistent with gastroenteritis, an inflamed gut, from any of a dozen innocent causes. While the doctors circled their vague diagnosis, the house itself had already reached a firmer one, because the servants had connected their private dots. The mistress's soaked flypapers upstairs, the master sinking. Alice Yap had begun to talk to the other staff in that low, protective, poisonous register of below-stairs alarm, and out in the city, alerted by an anonymous letter. Yes, there is an anonymous letter in this story too, and no one to this day knows who wrote it. The brothers Maybrick were beginning to turn their attention toward Battlecrease House. Edwin was already there, staying in the house, helping. Michael was in London, famous and formidable, and about to receive, from the nanny's own hands, the single most destructive piece of paper in this entire case. The flypapers were still just flypapers. For about 4 more days. Let's live inside those 4 days. The 3rd of May to the 7th, because the prosecution never did, and the days deserve it. This is the stretch where, if you believe the Crown, a murder was in progress. Look closely at what was actually happening, hour by hour, in that room. A Victorian sickroom was a workplace, and a brutal one. No hospital would touch a case like this. Hospitals were for the poor. A man of James's position was nursed at home or nowhere. That meant the bedroom at Battlecrease became a small, failing institution, staffed around the clock, supplied up 2 flights of stairs, every basin carried out by hand. The patient could hold almost nothing down. So the kitchen ran a constant production line of invalid food, the whole Victorian sickroom repertoire, beef tea, barley water, milk and soda, arrowroot, a patent lentil food called revalenta that James gagged on, and, on the sideboard of this story from here to the end, bottles of Valentine's meat juice, the concentrated beef tonic every chemist stocked. Spoonfuls in, basins out. A man visibly losing ground in a room that smelled of carbolic and beef. Dr. Humphreys came daily, sometimes twice. On the 7th, unsatisfied, the family brought in a second opinion, Dr. Carter from the city, a bigger name. Carter examined the wreck in the bed, conferred, and landed where Humphreys kept landing. Acute dyspepsia, an inflamed and furious gut. The prescriptions multiplied in the way that frightens modern doctors reading the case notes. One damping agent after another, washes and tonics and sedative mixtures, some of which, in the pharmacology of the day, contained their own small arsenical and metallic freight. That is not a scandal. It was the medicine of the time. It does mean that by the 2nd week, counting what the doctors ordered and what James had always taken on his own, that sickroom held more chemistry than a small dispensary, moving through many hands. Count the hands. This matters more than anything else in these 4 days. Florrie's hands, certainly, nursing him, in those early days with no one yet objecting. Also Edwin's hands, fetching and administering. The cook's hands, and the housemaid's hands on every dish and bottle on its way up. Nurse hands. Once professional nurses were engaged. The doctor's hands. James's own hands, and don't you dare forget those. Because nobody in that room knew his private inventory. The self-doser now marooned in bed within reach of a lifetime stash, feeling worse than he'd ever felt, and holding a fixed lifelong belief that the answer to feeling bad was another dose of something. Any honest picture of Battlecrease in the first week of May is not one poisoner and one victim. It is an unregulated pharmacy with a dozen sets of fingerprints, organized around a patient who was himself the most reckless chemist in the building. While the sickroom labored, the servants' hall held its own nightly session, and the temperature down there was dropping fast. The basin of Flypapers had been seen and catalogued. The mistress's London trip and the Aintree row were common property. Now the master was sinking, and the arithmetic below stairs was done with the speed such arithmetic is always done at. By the 6th and 7th of May, the staff of Battlecrease House were exchanging looks over the trays they carried. Not one of them said a word to a doctor. Hold on to that. We'll need it at the trial. If you truly believe you are watching a poisoning, silence is a strange way to show it. If instead you're enjoying the dark importance of a suspicion, silence is exactly how you keep it warm. Florrie, in these days, did something that the Crown would later hold up as brazen, and that reads, in the record, as something closer to oblivious. She wrote letters at the sick man's request, to his business friends, making light of his condition, in the hearty convention of the age. He's low but mending, no cause for alarm. She dealt with tradesmen. She sat up nights. On the 7th, she was tired enough that the doctors themselves suggested engaging professional nurses, and the first of them, from a Liverpool nursing institution, was engaged for the following day. Remember the sequence there. Trained, neutral, note-taking eyes were invited into that sickroom before the family suspected anything, at the routine suggestion of physicians, and Florrie raised no objection. Poisoners, as a class, do not usually welcome shift-working witnesses to the bedside. That was the state of the board on the evening of the 7th of May. A dying man diagnosed with a stomach disease. A wife worn down to the rims. A staff quietly convinced and quietly saying nothing. 2 doctors, puzzled but not alarmed in the forensic direction. A brother in the house, another in London with a telegraph office nearby. 4 days. That's all they were while they were happening. What turned them into chapter 1 of a murder was the piece of paper coming up the stairs in a nanny's apron pocket. The 8th of May, 1889, is the hinge. Everything in this case swings on a Wednesday. By that morning, James had been bedridden for nearly a week. Florrie, exhausted, was still splitting nursing shifts with the hired help. And at some point that day, she did something that, depending on which version of this woman you believe, was either brazen beyond comprehension or exactly what a cornered, frightened, not very wise young woman would do. She wrote to Alfred Brierly. She had a reason. Brierly, rattled by gossip after Aintree, had written to her about leaving the country. Her letter back was part reassurance, part plea, the letter of a woman trying to hold a door open. She wrote it in the sickroom's orbit, sealed it, and handed it to the nanny, Alice Yap, to take to the post. Handed it to Alice Yap. Of all the hands in that house, Yap did not post it. Her story, told under oath and never once believed by anybody who has read it since, was that she gave the letter to the baby to carry, that the baby dropped it in the mud, and that she then had to open it in order, naturally, to move it to a clean envelope. In the course of this humanitarian envelope transfer, she happened to read every word. 2 phrases in that letter detonated the case. Florrie had written that her husband was, quote, sick unto death, and she had signed off in terms that made the nature of things with Brierly unmistakable. Now watch what actually happens to this letter, because this is the machine of the next 3 days. Yap does not take it to Florrie, or to a doctor, or to James. She takes it to Edwin, the brother staying in the house. Edwin reads it. Edwin telegraphs Michael in London. Michael, the famous one, the one who already loathed his sister-in-law, comes north like weather. From the moment Michael Maybrick crosses the doorstep of Battlecrease, the house has a new master. He confers with the doctors, behind Florrie's back, and speaks the word out loud for the first time: poison. He orders that the mistress of the house be removed from nursing her own husband. Food and medicine now pass through the brothers and the hired nurses only. The servants are quietly told to watch her. Florrie Maybrick has just become a suspect in her own home, days before anyone can even say for certain there has been a crime. She has not been asked a single question. She is 26 years old. She has not slept properly in a week, and the walls of that 20-room house have turned to glass around her. Every cup she touches is inventoried. Every kindness is evidence. It's inside that glass box that the bottle finally enters the story. The night of the 9th of May. The hired nurse on duty, Nurse Gore, has a bottle of Valentine's meat juice for the patient. Florrie, by the nurse's sworn account, picks it up from the bedside and carries it out to the dressing room, out of sight, for a minute or so. She comes back, sets it down. The nurse notices and does not use it. The bottle is quietly removed and passed up the chain of suspicion, and when it is analyzed, there it is. Half a grain of arsenic that Valentine's factory certainly never put there. James never drank from that bottle. The prosecution agreed he never drank from it. Whatever was intended for it, nothing from it reached him. Florrie's explanation came later, from the doc, and it is either damning or heartbreaking, with no middle setting. She said James begged her for it, that he'd been pleading for his powder, the powder he leaned on, and that worn down at the end of another siege of a day, she took the bottle out of the room and stirred some in to quiet him. She said she didn't even know exactly what the powder was. On the 10th of May, she was barred from the sickroom entirely. On the same day, one of the doctors finally tested a sample from the patient for arsenic. The test came back negative. Sit with that. 3 days after the household privately convicted her, the actual patient, tested while still alive, showed no detectable arsenic in the sample. The doctors kept treating. The brothers kept watching. Nobody stood down, and James was dying now. Whatever the tests said, the vomiting had shredded him. His pulse came and went. On the 11th of May, a Saturday, with his brothers at the house and his wife collapsed in the spare room under what the era called brain fever and we would call a total nervous breakdown, James Maybrick died at about 20 minutes to 9 in the evening, 50 years old. He never accused anyone, by the way. 2 weeks of dying, surrounded by people already whispering the word poison, and the man himself never once pointed at his wife. Hold that detail. It costs nothing, and it never made it into the prosecution's arithmetic. What happened next happened fast, and it happened while Florrie Maybrick was unconscious. With the widow prostrate down the hall, Michael and Edwin turned Battlecrease House over. And the house, That overstuffed pharmacy of a house gave them everything they were primed to find. Bottles by the dozen, packets, powders. In her trunk, wrapped and tucked away, a packet actually labeled in handwriting, arsenic, poison for cats. In a hat box, more, traces, in a tumbler, in a pan, soaked into the fibers of a dressing gown pocket. When the analysts finished cataloging the household's total inventory, the newspapers did the arithmetic out loud and produced their favorite fact of the season. Scattered through that house was enough arsenic, in one form or another, to kill a small crowd. The house of a 20-year arsenic habit had been searched as the house of a 3-week murder plot. Everything the husband had spent 2 decades accumulating was now exhibits against the wife. On the 14th of May, still too weak to stand, Florence Maybrick was arrested in her bed on the charge of murdering her husband. Her mother, the Baroness, raced from Paris and was met at the door of Battlecrease by servants under new instructions. Within weeks, everything inside that house, her clothes, her letters, her children's things, would be catalogued for creditors and strangers. She had entered it as its mistress. She left it on a stretcher, under guard. The children were taken to be raised by others. She had seen them for the last time. She did not know that yet. It was the last ordinary cruelty of May, and nobody had even meant it as one. There simply was no procedure for goodbye. The door clicks shut behind her, and from here, the state takes over the story. There's a version of this story where the trial is the first time Florence Maybrick faces a jury. The truth is worse. Before St. George's Hall, she was tried twice more, in rooms with fewer rules, and lost both times, and the whole country got to watch the rehearsals. First, though, Liverpool buried James Maybrick, and even the funeral was a verdict. He was laid in the family grave at Anfield Cemetery, under a fine turnout of cotton men and civic black, the brothers presiding, the papers respectful. His widow was not among the mourners. She was under guard, barely conscious, a mile away, and the arrangement suited the new management of Battlecrease perfectly. The optics wrote themselves. The family grieving at the graveside, and the American wife conspicuous in her absence. Which absence, you'll notice, the same family had itself arranged. Her mother reached England within days, and the Baroness von Roques, in full sail, was the one force in this story the Maybrick brothers couldn't simply instruct. She stormed the newspapers. She stormed the lawyers. She was reduced, at one point, to arguing on doorsteps for access to her own prostrate daughter, and to watching strangers inventory her daughter's household down to the underclothes. Everything in that house was now potential evidence or potential creditor's property, and the speed of it took even Victorian observers aback. Within a season, the furniture would be sold, the children relocated and reparented, the household dissolved like a firm in receivership. James died on a Saturday. By the following Saturday, the life Florrie Maybrick had lived for 8 years effectively did not exist. There's one more scene from those weeks, and it's the one the Gothic novelists of the age would have blushed to invent. At the end of May, a fortnight after the flowers, the authorities went back to Anfield Cemetery and opened the grave. The first analysis had been run on samples taken at the post-mortem, and the Crown's chemists wanted the rest of him. So it was done the way such things were done, at night, by lantern light, officials and diggers and doctors standing in a ring of yellow glow among the headstones, while James Maybrick was brought back up into the air of Liverpool and opened a second time. More organs went into more jars for the analysts. The night detail wasn't squeamishness about crowds, or not only that. It was standard caution. It also meant that somewhere in the city that same night, in a cell, the woman whose life depended on what those jars contained knew nothing about any of it. Nobody was obliged to tell her, so nobody did. Hold the image anyway, because it's the case in miniature. The crown, digging by lantern light for a fatal dose, and the jars, when the weighing was done, refusing, politely, to provide one. Then came rehearsal one, the inquest. A Victorian inquest was theoretically a neutral inquiry into a death. 12 local men and a coroner, gathered in whatever room could hold them, in this case, rooms in the neighborhood of the house itself. In practice, in a case like this, it was a preview of the prosecution with none of the defense's machinery. The servants told their stories. The Flypapers and the basin and the letter made their public debut. The analysts reported arsenic in the meat juice and in the house, and the newspapers transcribed every syllable to a public already fed weeks of leaks. Florrie was too ill to attend the opening. It hardly mattered. The coroner's jury did what coroner's juries did with a story shaped like this one. They found that James Maybrick died of an irritant poison administered by his wife. A room of local men, no cross-examination worth the name, verdict, murder. Rehearsal 2 came before the magistrates. A committal hearing to decide whether a full trial was warranted, and this one she had to attend. It's from these days we get some of the most quietly awful scenes in the whole case. Florence Maybrick, weeks into custody, thin, veiled, in new widow's black, carried into a packed Liverpool courtroom to sit through the entire story again. The crowds outside, pressing to see her the way crowds press at an accident. Ladies with lorgnettes filling the gallery seats. The magistrates heard the same parade, plus a detail the Crown now leaned on hard, the hotel week in London, read into the public record with addresses and dates while she sat there behind her veil. Committed for trial at the summer assizes, removed to Walton Gaol, to the hospital wing, where she would wait out the 10 weeks, to the assizes writing letters that grew steadily more frightened and formal. So tally the score before a single juror was ever sworn at the real trial. One public inquiry had already named her a murderer. A second public hearing had already committed her. Every servant's anecdote, every soaked paper, every line of the Brierly letter had been printed, reprinted, cabled to New York, illustrated in the weeklies, and chewed over at every dinner table in Lancashire for 3 consecutive months. The Maybrick Mystery was the entertainment of the season on 2 continents. Alfred Brierly, the co-star of The Motive, had prudently arranged to be elsewhere, leaving her alone under the lights. There was not a juror-eligible man in the north of England who hadn't already heard this case twice, told by one side. Modern courts move trials for a fraction of this. 1889 moved nothing but the venue's furniture. The assizes came to Liverpool in the last week of July, to the Great Stone Temple on Lime Street, and the third telling of the story, the only one that legally counted, was given to a city that already knew its lines by heart. The rehearsals were over. The reviews were already in. Before we walk into St. George's Hall, I need 10 minutes of your patience for something that isn't a scene. It's the machine itself. Because you cannot feel the size of what happens to Florence Maybrick in August unless you can see the 3 ways the machine of 1889 was built with no reverse gear. First, in 1889, a defendant in an English murder trial could not testify, not would not, could not. The law held that an accused person was too interested a party to give sworn evidence in their own case. That right if you can believe it, did not arrive in England until 1898, 9 years too late for her. The most Florence Maybrick would ever be permitted was an unsworn statement from the dock, a few minutes of speech, not under oath, not open to cross-examination, and, precisely because it wasn't sworn, easy for a judge to wave away like pipe smoke. The one person on earth who knew what the Flypapers were for was legally forbidden from being questioned about it. Second, there was no court of criminal appeal. None. This surprises people so much I'll say it twice. In the England of 1889, if a jury convicted you of murder, on bad evidence, on a judge's blunder, on the moon being full, there existed no court anywhere with the power to review that verdict. The Court of Criminal Appeal would not be created until 1907, and legal historians will tell you plainly that the case we are watching tonight is one of the scandals that forced its creation. The only safety net under a condemned prisoner was the Home Secretary, a politician, reviewing the case in private, answerable to nobody's rules of evidence. Remember the shape of that net. She's going to land in it. Third, her jury. 12 men, by law, property holders, tradesmen, and farmers among them, impaneled in a city that had spent 3 months marinating in the case. The Maybrick Mystery had been front-page material on 2 continents since May. The Inquest, held while she lay under arrest, had already voted against her. The magistrates had already sent her up. Liverpool had, in every practical sense, already rehearsed this trial twice in public before a single juror was sworn. Today we'd call it a poisoned pool and move the venue. In 1889, it was called Wednesday. That is the machine. No voice, no appeal, and a preheated jury. Into it walks one asset she did not expect, and it's a big one. Sir Charles Russell took her brief. Understand who this is. Russell was the most celebrated advocate in the English-speaking world that year, fresh from a legendary performance before the Parnell Commission, a future Lord Chief Justice of England. Irish, magnetic, ferociously quick. For the defense of a scandalous American widow in a provincial poisoning case, it was like a parish production hiring the greatest actor alive. Her American connections and her mother's frantic fundraising got him. He believed in the case, and, this matters later, he never stopped. Long after the verdict, at the summit of the English legal system, Charles Russell kept this woman's file on his desk like a stone in his shoe. One great advocate then, against the machine, the city, the press, and the family. The trial of Florence Maybrick opened at St. George's Hall, Liverpool, on the 31st of July, 1889. It was scheduled for the summer assizes, like any other case. It behaved like nothing Liverpool had ever seen. If you've ever seen a photograph of St. George's Hall, you know it doesn't look like a courthouse. It looks like a Roman temple that lost its way and settled across from a railway station. Vast columns, acres of stone. The Victorians built it as a boast, and in the first week of August, 1889, it became the most famous room in the world. The scenes outside are in every account. Crowds pressing the steps from early morning. Tickets to the public gallery hoarded and traded like derby seats. Ladies of Liverpool society arriving with opera glasses and packed lunches. Newsboys selling out editions between sessions. Under it all, that carnival hum a city makes when it has already decided how the show ends and has come to watch it happen. Inside, at the center of all of it, in black, a small American widow who had spent the last 11 weeks in a jail hospital ward, so weakened she was given a chair. The Crown's case was opened by Mr. John Addison, Queen's Counsel, and I want to give the prosecution its due, because if you only listen to the first 2 days, it sounds devastating. Addison built the story you have already watched me build, except with every ambiguity shaved off. A faithless wife, caught at Aintree, beaten, facing ruin. A hotel week with her lover, Flypapers, bought twice, soaked in secret. A husband falling sick within days. A letter in her own hand, to her lover, announcing him sick unto death, while the doctors still called it dyspepsia, as if, Addison suggested, she alone knew the destination. A bottle of invalid's food, carried from the room by her hands, returned with half a grain of arsenic inside. A house found stuffed with poison, some of it wrapped among her private things. Motive, means, opportunity, sequence. Each servant took the stand and added a plank. Alice Yap and the muddy letter, the housemaid and the basin, Nurse Gore and the bottle, the brothers, grave and respectable, describing their growing alarm. Sitting in the gallery, you'd have felt the floor of the story harden under your feet. The narrative clicked, everything fit. Then Sir Charles Russell stood up to cross-examine, and Liverpool got to watch the most expensive scalpel in England go to work on its favorite story. He started where the story started, with the servants, and what he did to Alice Yap's letter became one of the trial's set pieces. Yap, remember, claimed she'd opened her mistress's private letter to Brierly because the baby had dropped it in the mud, obliging her, as a conscientious nanny, to transfer it to a clean envelope. Russell took that explanation apart seam by seam in front of the gallery. He made her walk through it. The child carrying the letter, the puddle, the decision that a muddy envelope required not a wipe, not a fresh cover slipped over the old one, but a full opening, an unfolding, and, somewhere in the process, a thorough read of the contents, followed not by delivery to the postbox or the mistress, but to the master's brother. He pressed her on whether the letter had even been wet at all. The gallery, primed all week to hiss the poisoner, found itself laughing at the Crown's nanny, and the laughter had an edge, because everyone in that room recognized what they were looking at. Not a guardian of the sick man, a servant who had appointed herself detective over an employer she plainly disliked, and had been sitting on her collection for weeks. That mattered beyond the comedy. The Crown's whole opening act rested on the household's testimony being neutral observation, honest folk reluctantly reporting what they saw. Russell reframed it, witness by witness, as what it actually was, a below-stairs verdict reached early, on gossip and grudge, with the evidence gathered afterward to fit. The basin nobody asked about, the whispers that ran through the servants' hall for a fortnight, while not one of them raised an alarm that might have, on their own theory, saved the master's life. If they truly believed the mistress was poisoning him, Russell let the jury notice. They had watched it happen. If they didn't believe it at the time, then all of it, the basin, the bottle, the letter, was suspicion applied retroactively, after the brothers arrived and the word poison was in the walls. Then the brothers themselves. Michael in the box was granite, certain, every inch the famous man, and Russell let the certainty convict itself. Michael had decided on poisoning before any doctor said so, on the strength of a nanny's intercepted letter. He had taken over the house, sequestered the patient, excluded the wife, ordered the watching, commissioned the searches. Under cross-examination, the shape of it stood out plainly. Every physical exhibit the Crown now brandished had been found, handled, and interpreted by a family already committed to her guilt, in a house they controlled, while she lay sedated down the corridor. Chain of custody is a modern phrase. The thing itself is ancient, and in this case it ran through the hands of her declared enemies, every link. Even Nurse Gore's bottle, the half-grain itself, came out of cross-examination smaller than it went in. The nurse was honest and precise, the incident real, and the sum of it, tested, was this. The bottle left the room with the wife, came back, was intercepted, was analyzed. The patient never touched it. Nothing connected its contents to anything actually inside James Maybrick. As evidence of intent, it was suggestive as the devil. As evidence of murder, of this man dying by this poison from this hand, it was a sealed bottle on a shelf, pointing at nothing. By the weekend, the courtroom arithmetic had quietly shifted. The Crown had proved, past argument, a miserable marriage, an adultery, a soaking basin, a suspicious household, and one tampered bottle nobody drank. What it had not yet proved was the only thing the indictment actually alleged, that James Maybrick died of arsenic at all. Everything now rested on the doctors, and when the doctors started testifying, the floor began to move, because the Crown's case had a load-bearing wall it could not decorate around forever. To hang Florence Maybrick, the Crown had to prove not only that she'd handled arsenic, not only that her marriage was rotten, but that James Maybrick actually died of arsenic poisoning. That is the entire building. A poisoning trial without a proven poisoning is a séance, and on that one indispensable point, the Crown's own evidence came apart in open court. Start with the body, because the analysts did. The chemists who examined James Maybrick's remains went in looking for the signature of an arsenic death, and an arsenic death, medically, is not subtle. A fatal dose is reckoned in grains, 2 or more by the standard texts of the day, and a body killed by it usually holds the receipts. What the analysis of James Maybrick actually produced was this. In the stomach, where a recent killing dose ought to announce itself, the analysts reported none at all. Traces turned up deeper in the liver and the intestines, and when everything recovered from that body was added together, the total came to a fraction of a single grain. Set that against the textbook fatal dose, and you get the arithmetic Russell hammered into the record. The poison actually found in the dead man amounted to something like a fifth of the smallest quantity anyone would call reliably lethal, less arsenic in the entire body than in the meat juice bottle he never drank. Now, a fair prosecutor can argue around a low reading. Arsenic passes through. 11 days of vomiting and purging will flush a system. All true and all argued. But every one of those arguments has to squeeze past the same man standing in the middle of the road, and that man is James Maybrick himself, the walking exception. Because the defense called witnesses, the Crown could not shake. The Liverpool chemist, who had mixed him arsenic pick-me-ups for years and watched him press for double strength. The evidence from Norfolk, Virginia, of a standing arsenic habit, carried like a lunch order. Friends who'd heard him boast that his daily doses would kill an ordinary man, a body that had spent years learning to carry poison and to shed it. So the residue in the liver stopped being a signature and became a shrug. Traces of arsenic in a chronic arsenic eater prove exactly nothing about the last 2 weeks of his life. They are Tuesday. That left the symptoms, and here the Crown's wall properly buckled. Russell put up 2 of the most formidable medical authorities in the kingdom, Dr. Charles Mymott Tidy and Dr. Rawdon McNamara, men who had spent careers on poisons, and their testimony was flatly, unbendingly, that the illness recorded at that bedside did not read as arsenical poisoning. The pattern was wrong. What it read as, they said, was gastroenteritis, a savage inflammation of the gut, entirely capable of killing a run-down, self-drugged, 50-year-old man who'd taken a soaking and a double dose of strychnine medicine and then been dosed and redosed by committee for a fortnight. And when Russell turned to the Crown's own bedside doctors, the men who had actually treated James, he extracted the quiet, devastating concessions that live in the transcript. They had diagnosed dyspepsia, then gastritis. They had prescribed for it. The test for arsenic run while the patient still breathed had come back negative. Nothing at that bedside had forced the word arsenic on anyone, until the family started saying it out loud. Follow the sum here, the way a juror sworn to reasonable doubt was supposed to. No proven fatal dose in the body. No arsenic at all where a fresh dose should sit. A victim with a documented, years-deep habit of eating the very poison alleged. The Crown's own doctors, conceding the sickbed, never looked like poisoning while they stood at it. Eminent independent experts saying flatly, this was disease, not murder. Whatever you privately suspect of Florence Maybrick, and you're allowed to suspect plenty, that is not a proven poisoning. Strip away the hotel week and the soaked papers, and ask only the question the indictment asked. Did the Crown prove this man was murdered at all? And the honest answer, on the evidence in that room, was no. The great legal writers who dissected this case afterward kept arriving at the same place. You cannot hang a woman for causing a death that medicine cannot certify as a killing. On the 6th of August, Florence Maybrick stood up in the dock to give the only account the law allowed her, and even the reporters who had spent 3 months monetizing her disgrace went quiet for it. Picture the room. The great hall packed to the cornices, the August heat, the rustle of 200 fans and notebooks stopping all at once. A small woman rising in the dock between warders, steadying herself on the rail with both gloved hands, and beginning to speak in a voice the back rows had to strain for, an American voice, frayed to a thread by 11 weeks of custody. Several times she stopped, gathered, went on. The judge did not interrupt. For 5 minutes, the only power she had left in the world was the oldest one there is, a person, telling her own story, out loud, once. It was a few minutes, unsworn, untestable. She was faint, barely audible, in black. She told the court the Flypapers had been for a face wash, a cosmetic she'd used since girlhood, brewed for a ball because her skin had broken out, and that she'd hidden the soaking the way you hide any vanity. She told them about the meat juice, that James had begged her for his powder, worn her down at the end of a terrible day, and that she had stirred it in not knowing precisely what it was, and that he never drank it. She said she'd been too ill, and then too shut out, to explain any of it to the men who'd taken over her house. 2 sentences of it, everyone who was there agreed, landed like dropped glass. She said her husband's family had condemned her in his sickroom, while she was still his nurse, and she closed on the only ground she had left, that whatever her sins as a wife, and she named them, she was not guilty of murder, unsworn, untestable, easy to wave away. It needed only one more voice to do the waving, and that voice had been sitting above her all week, in scarlet, getting sicker by the day. Mr. Justice James Fitzjames Stephen was, on paper, one of the great legal minds of the Victorian age, author of the standard history of the criminal law. A pillar. That's the paper version. The man who actually presided at St. George's Hall in August 1889 was 4 years past a stroke, visibly failing, and 2 years from being retired off the bench by his own doctors after his decline became a matter of open press comment. Within 5 years of this trial, he would be dead, his mind gone, in a private institution near Ipswich. That is not retrospective gossip. People in that courtroom watched him lose the thread in real time. Counsel corrected his dates. Reporters noted the muddles. Across 2 full days of summing up, the longest speech of the trial, Justice Stephen misstated evidence, tangled the chronology, attributed testimony to the wrong witnesses, and had to be steered back like a man walked to his own front door. A confused summing up is a catastrophe in any capital case. What made this one fatal was its direction, because somewhere in those 2 days, the case stopped being about arsenic, and Stephen aimed it, deliberately and repeatedly, at the one charge the defense could never answer: adultery. The judge put it to the jury, in Victorian dress but in substance exactly this: that a woman capable of what Florence Maybrick did at Flatman's Hotel was a woman whose word meant nothing and whose hand you could believe capable of anything. Her infidelity was paraded not as context, but as engine, the very motive for what he called a horrible crime, proof of the kind of woman she was. The medical collapse at the center of the Crown's case, the missing fatal dose, the negative test, the habit, received its mentions, muddled, and then was buried under the moral avalanche. 12 Victorian property owners were invited, from the Scarlet Bench itself, to convict a proven adulteress of an unproven murder, and to feel righteous doing it. The lawyers in the room understood what was happening. The reporters understood. There's a reason the legal profession spent the next 2 decades citing this exact trial as the argument for building an appeals court. Everyone understood, except the 12 men it was aimed at, and they went out to deliberate on the afternoon of the 7th of August. They were not out long. The accounts disagree on the exact count: 35 minutes by some, 3/4 of an hour by others, and no account lets it reach a full hour. 7 days of evidence, a capital charge, a contested cause of death. They were back before the gallery had finished its tea. Guilty. Asked if she had anything to say, Florence Maybrick, by the reports of that room, held the rail and said, in substance, that except for her intimacy with Brierly, she was not guilty of this crime. The clerk of the court had already reached for the square of black silk. Justice Stephen, the failing man who had just spent 2 days making this verdict, put it on and sentenced her to be taken to the place of execution and hanged by the neck until she was dead, and may the Lord have mercy on her soul. She did not scream. Witnesses describe something worse: a person simply vacating, half fainting, carried down from the dock white as the paper this was printed on. Then Liverpool did something strange, and you should let it be strange. The crowd outside St. George's Hall, the same city that had marinated in this scandal all summer, heard the verdict come out the doors, and it did not cheer the law. It cheered her. When she was brought out to the prison van, the crowd roared support at the condemned woman. When the jurors emerged, they were hissed in the street. When the judge's carriage moved, it was hooted through a police cordon. The ordinary people of a Victorian city, no sentimentalists about poisoners, had sat through the same newspapers as everyone else and reached the verdict the jury somehow hadn't. Whatever that woman was, this had not been proved. The machine, you'll remember, had no reverse gear. No appeal existed. In 14 days, on the 26th of August, she would hang at Walton. What stood between Florence Maybrick and the rope was no court on earth, just one politician's desk, and the strangest piece of paper in Victorian legal history was about to be written on it. They measured her for the drop. That is not a dramatic flourish. It's procedure. A condemned prisoner at Walton Gaol was weighed and measured so the executioner could calculate the fall, and the newspapers reported that the machinery of her hanging was being made ready while the country argued. The state's hangman in those years, James Barry, was reported summoned north. She was moved to the condemned cell, watched day and night by female warders in shifts. 3 weeks from the 26th of August, then too, she spent it, in the accounts that survive, in a state past fear, writing letters, sleeping little, attended by the chaplain and a rotation of female warders whose one standing duty, in a condemned cell, was never to leave the prisoner alone with herself. Her mother stormed between lawyers and newspapers, and outside those walls something happened that 1889 was not built for and had no procedure to absorb. The public changed sides, loudly, on both sides of an ocean at the same time. Watch the English press first, because the reversal there was the strangest. These were the same papers that had spent 3 months roasting the Aigburth adulteress, printing her hotel dates, selling her infamy by the edition. The verdict should have been their victory lap. Instead, within days, the tone curdled into something between doubt and open revolt. Editorial columns began doing, in public, the exact exercise Justice Stephen had discouraged in court, separating the adultery from the arithmetic. Where, they asked, was the fatal dose? What exactly had the jury convicted her of that the Crown's own doctors couldn't agree had happened? Papers that loathed her printed the question anyway, because the question had teeth and everyone could feel it. Being scandalous was not a capital offense. Yet, the professions came next, and this is where it stopped being noise and became pressure. The legal press took the trial apart, with the cold fury lawyers reserve for a colleague who has embarrassed the whole guild. The summing up was dissected, its confusions itemized, and the structural scandal underneath it said out loud, in the plainest terms yet, that a woman was going to hang in England on a verdict no court in the country had the power to review. The medical journals ran their own autopsy, on the evidence rather than the man, and eminent names lined up to say in print what Tidy and McNamara had said in the box. The dose was not there. The symptoms were not distinctive. The science, as presented, could not carry a rope. Then there were the memorials, which is the Victorian word for petitions, with their hats on. They poured toward the Home Office on a scale the clerks had rarely seen. From Liverpool itself, the city that had watched the trial, sheets of working-class signatures gathered street by street. From London, from the medical men, from members of the bar, public meetings were got up in her name in a dozen cities. When it was all raked together, the signatures ran into the hundreds of thousands, and the mail sacks into a clerical emergency. However you score the case itself, understand what this was procedurally. The public, the press, the doctors, and half the legal profession of England were petitioning a politician because a politician was the only appeal court the empire owned, and that was just the Eastern Shore. In America, the story went off like a struck match in dry grass. An American citizen, a banker's daughter from Mobile, Alabama, had been condemned to death by a foreign court, on medical evidence that foreign courts' own experts called inadequate, after a trial in which she could not testify, with no appeal permitted anywhere on earth. American newspapers did not cover that story. They campaigned it. Mass meetings gathered in American cities. Resolutions passed. Cables crossed the Atlantic in bundles. Secretary of State James Blaine took an interest that everyone in London could feel through the floor, and the American minister in London made the government's concern formally, politely, unmistakably known. It was the beginning of a diplomatic pressure that would outlast Blaine, outlast his president, and keep arriving, administration after administration, for 15 years. Inside the Home Office, Henry Matthews now sat where every current in the storm converged. And let's be fair to the man for one paragraph, because his position was genuinely impossible. Uphold the sentence and hang a woman on evidence the country's own experts had publicly gutted, with the mail sacks still arriving and America watching. Pardon her outright and declare before the world that English justice, which had no mechanism to correct itself, had nearly strangled an innocent widow, that the jury blundered, that the great Justice Stephen had presided over a catastrophe. There was no third door built into the system, so Matthews, a lawyer to his fingertips, did what the cornered do. He built one. On the 22nd of August, 1889, 4 days before the scheduled execution, the Home Secretary, having taken advice from the trial judge and, quietly, from doctors of his own, announced the decision of the Crown. Florence Maybrick would not hang. The sentence was commuted to penal servitude for life. Now here is the document I promised you at the start of tonight, the paper that saved her life. I want you to hear its logic in its own official words, because I might otherwise be accused of inventing them. The commutation rested on this stated ground, that although the evidence leads to the conclusion that the prisoner administered and attempted to administer arsenic to her husband with intent to murder, yet it does not wholly exclude a reasonable doubt whether his death was in fact caused by the administration of arsenic. Read it again slowly, the way the legal profession did that week, with rising disbelief. The jury convicted her of murder. The Home Office now says there is reasonable doubt that any murder occurred, that the death may not have been caused by arsenic at all. In any coherent system, that sentence is an acquittal. Reasonable doubt about the cause of death is reasonable doubt about the crime. The conviction should have dissolved. Instead, the same sentence pivots and convicts her of something else. She administered arsenic with intent to murder, it declares. Attempted murder, in other words. A charge on which she had never been indicted, never tried, never defended. No jury ever heard 1 minute of argument on attempt. A politician, in a private room, reviewing a file, simply substituted one felony for another and assigned the punishment himself. Life. The lawyers of 2 nations said exactly what you're thinking. She has been convicted by a jury of a crime the government admits may not have happened, and sentenced by a minister for a crime with which she was never charged. It was, said one furious legal commentary after another, not mercy but arithmetic fraud, a compromise between a verdict that could not be defended and an establishment that could not admit it. Punish her anyway. File it under mercy. That single paragraph is why this case never died, and never will, until somebody in an official chair reads it honestly. The rope was gone. The reasoning that removed it convicted her twice. She learned all of this in the condemned cell at Walton, from officials, in the flat language of the state. Her life was spared. Her life, as anyone lives one, was over. Penal servitude for life, in that England, meant a silence with walls, and she was 26 years old. The crowd noise outside St. George's Hall was 3 weeks old, and already a memory. What replaced it was quieter and lasted 15 years. A cell door, closing at the same hour every night, somewhere in the south of England. Woking Convict Prison, Surrey, where they first sent her, ran on a theory. The theory was that a felon's old self should be dismantled, and the tool for dismantling it was silence. By her own account, and the prison practice of the era backs its outline, the sentence opened with roughly 9 months of solitary confinement. Probation, the system called it. A cell, a plank bed, a Bible, work brought to the door, and almost no human voice. She wrote later that this was the part that came nearest to killing her, and that when she finally emerged into the ordinary regime was this: a brown convict dress with an ID number, where a name used to be. Silence at labor, silence at meals, exercise in a ring of women, walking apart from each other in a stone yard. Sewing, endless sewing, shirts and canvas by the 1,000 stitch. Later they moved her to Aylesbury Prison, and the scenery of the walls changed, and nothing else did. 15 years is easy to say. Try it as arithmetic instead. She went in at 26, the age where life is all forward. The regime allowed a convict in her class a visit only at long intervals, a few times a year at best, 20 minutes or so at a time, through wire and under a warder's eye, and her visitor was nearly always the same person, her mother, older each time, crossing from the continent to spend 20 minutes being watched. Letters were rationed, read by officials both ways, and written to a schedule. In the middle 90s, the women's establishment shifted, and she went with it, from Woking to Aylesbury. New walls, same clock. She sewed. She kept her conduct record clean, year over year, the way you keep the only ledger they leave you. Every year, the machinery outside rattled on her behalf, and every year, it produced nothing. Do the sums on the children. Her son was 7 when the door shut, her daughter 3. They were taken in by a doctor's family and raised under a changed name, Fuller, scrubbed of Maybrick the way you'd scrub a stain. The record of the next 15 years contains their school fees and their new lives. It contains no visits to their mother. As far as any document shows, after May of 1889, Florence Maybrick never saw either of her children again. Not once, for the rest of a long life. What was it actually like inside? We have her own answer, book length, written the moment she was free, and even allowing for every grain of salt you'd bring to any prisoner's memoir. It is a document worth hearing from, because on the texture of the system, it agrees with every official source we have. The texture was the punishment. She described the probation cell where the sentence began, a space she could cross in a few short steps, the plank bed, the tin utensils, the single small window too high to see anything through but weather. She described the sounds of a convict prison at night, which were not screams. Screams would at least have been company, but coughs, and boots on stone, and keys. Above all, she described the silence rule, the engineered core of the English system, which forbade prisoners from speaking to one another at labor, at exercise, at meals, month over month, year over year. Human beings are not built for that, and she watched women around her quietly break under it, and by her own account, came to the edge of breaking more than once herself. The medical registers back her up in outline. Her health gave way repeatedly across the 15 years, and long stretches of her sentence were served in prison infirmaries, which she remembered, with a bleak gratitude that tells you everything, as the good parts. The infirmary had voices in it. There's one passage of her book people always quote, and I'll give you its substance because it explains the rest of her life. She wrote that the hardest discipline of a life sentence was not the labor or the food, it was hope. Hope arrived every time the campaign outside made noise. A new memorial, a new Home Secretary, an American envoy asking questions. and hope had to be survived, because when the answer came back no, and it always came back no, the fall afterward was worse than never having stood up. She learned, she said, to ration it. A person who teaches herself to be careful with hope in her 20s is a person you will find, decades later, perfectly content in a 3-room cottage full of cats, wanting nothing from anybody. The cottage was built in Aylesbury. Connecticut just supplied the lumber. Meanwhile, the case refused to close, because the case had a quality very few injustices are lucky enough to have. Powerful people who could not stop picking at it. Sir Charles Russell never let it go. This is the man who became Lord Chief Justice of England, the highest judge in the land, and who kept writing to Home Secretaries about the prisoner at Aylesbury, bluntly, that he had defended many guilty clients, and this was not one of them, that the conviction rested on evidence no court should have accepted. Imagine that for a second. The head of English justice, privately petitioning the government about a specific woman in one of its prisons, year after year, and being declined, year after year, because the state had found its filing position and would not move. New evidence arrived, and the filing position still would not move. In 1894, a Norfolk businessman named Valentine Blake came forward and swore an affidavit that, months before James Maybrick's death, he had personally supplied James with a large quantity of arsenic on the order of 150 grains in the course of a business arrangement. 150 grains. Enough to kill dozens of men, or supply one practiced arsenic eater for a good long while, and enough, incidentally, to explain the poisoned landscape the brothers found when they searched Battlecrease, the packets, the traces, the tumblers, all of it catalogued in 1889 as the wife's arsenal. The Home Office noted the affidavit and filed it. In America, the pressure never slackened. Petitions organized by women journalists gathered names across the country. Senators raised her. Successive ambassadors raised her. Blaine's State Department and the ones after it kept her file warm for 3 presidencies, and London kept receiving the pressure with perfect courtesy and perfect immobility. Somewhere in the correspondence of the era sits the sentence that best explains the immobility, attributed to the very top. Queen Victoria is recorded as regretting only that so wicked a woman should escape the rope on what she called a legal quibble. The sovereign believed the woman guilty. The sovereign's ministers had declared the death unproven. Both positions were held, simultaneously, for 15 years, by a state that never once agreed to test either one in a courtroom. Victoria died in January 1901. The temperature changed within months. The new reign wanted the file closed, and a decision quietly followed that the life sentence would be treated as 20 years less remission, which worked out, with bureaucratic tidiness, to release in early 1904, no pardon. Understand the terms exactly, because they are the terms she carried to her grave. The conviction stood. The Crown conceded nothing, apologized for nothing, reopened nothing. The state simply finished with her, the way a machine finishes with a part. On the 25th of January, 1904, a gate opened in Aylesbury, and a 41-year-old woman walked out of it into a country that had spent 15 years arguing about her. She had entered prison in the reign of Victoria, tried by gaslight and hansom cab. She came out into a world of motor cars and moving pictures, gray-haired at the temples, half forgotten and world-famous at the same time. They took her first, discreetly, to a convent at Truro, down in Cornwall, where nuns fed her and let her sleep and taught her, in 6 quiet months, how to be a person who chooses what time to stand up. Then she did the only thing left. She went home to America, to the applause of strangers, which is the loneliest sound there is. New York gave her a celebrity's landing. Reporters swarmed the pier in August of 1904, shouting questions at a small woman in black at the rail, and the papers next morning ran columns on her dress, her composure, her southern vowels worn smooth by an English prison. She was 41 and looked older, and she managed the crowds with a strange, formal calm that one reporter after another remarked on without knowing what they were looking at. 15 years of the silent system will teach a person to stand very still while being stared at. America had spent those 15 years being angry on her behalf, and for one season, that anger paid her bills. She was received by sympathizers in drawing rooms from New York to Washington. Committees that had petitioned for her got to shake the hand they'd saved. Her case was cited in Congress and in Bar Association speeches as the standing example of why civilized systems need appellate courts. And she was, for a moment, that rarest American product, a cause with a pulse, available for bookings. She wrote the book, Mrs. Maybrick's Own Story, My 15 Lost Years, published in 1905, a prison memoir wrapped around a protest of innocence, and it sold. She took to the lecture circuit, standing on stages in American cities in her plain dark dress, telling gaslight audiences about the condemned cell and English prison silence and the verdict she would spend her life denying. She spoke about prison reform. She was received, wondered at, pitied. For a while there was real money. Here's the thing about being famous for a wound. The audience heals faster than you do. For the first few seasons the halls were full, and she was, witnesses said, surprisingly good at it. Composed, precise, no theatrics. The same contained woman the peer reporters had met, telling strangers in Ohio and Missouri what a silent cell does to a human mind, and asking them to care about prisoners they would never meet. The papers covered her respectfully, then a little less, then mostly when something else dragged the old case back up. The lecture bookings thinned as the new century found fresher scandals. The book stopped selling. The woman on the stage got older, and the story stayed the same, because it was true, and the truth doesn't update well. She tried what came next, for gentlewomen of collapsing means, boarding houses, patrons, small ventures that ate the remaining money. Her mother, the Baroness, who had fought 2 governments for her, died with the accounts between them still tangled in old loans. And the 2 people for whom she'd have traded every lecture fee on earth stayed exactly where the state had put them, in 1889, out of reach. Her son grew up as James Fuller and became a mining engineer in Canada, a serious, well-liked young man in every surviving description. In 1911, at the Leroy mine in British Columbia, at 29 years old, he swallowed cyanide, by every account an accident, a lab glass mistaken for water, and died almost at once. Think about being his mother, reading that in a newspaper. Poison had now taken her husband, 15 years of her life, and her son, and she had not been permitted to attend any of the 3 catastrophes. Her daughter Gladys had been raised, for part of her girlhood, in the household of the uncle who led the charge against her mother, Michael, in his comfortable retirement at Ryde on the Isle of Wight. Let that arrangement sit on your tongue for a second. Gladys married in London in 1912. There's no record her mother was invited, no record of a meeting, ever. Just a name in wedding announcements, an ocean away. That used to be a 3-year-old she kissed goodnight at Battlecrease. Somewhere in those years, Florence Maybrick did the final arithmetic of her life and acted on it. Fame had failed. Vindication was never coming. The name itself was the wound. So she put the name down. She began using her maiden name, Chandler. She drifted out of the cities, out of the columns, off the stages, shrinking her life smaller and smaller until, in 1918, we find her doing paid housekeeping in rural Connecticut, and in 1919, with the last of her means, buying a scrap of land near Gaylordsville, up in the wooded northwest corner of the state, and having a 3-room cottage built on it. One of the most famous women of the Victorian world, the name that had moved parliaments and presidents, now answered to the handful of neighbors who had any reason to speak to her, to Mrs. Chandler, and rural Connecticut, bless it, did not ask questions. The Disappearing Act held for more than 20 years. It held so well that the last chapter of this story could happen, which is the strangest chapter of all, because it's the one with kindness in it. The land she'd bought sat practically against the boundary of a boys' boarding school. South Kent School, small, Episcopal, founded just a few years before she arrived, full of teenage boys in ties, doing chores between chapel and class. To those boys, and to the town, she was simply the Catwoman, a tiny, odd, fierce old lady in layered rags, living alone in a cottage that was going feral around her, with cats. Dozens of cats, cats past counting, fed better than she fed herself. She kept newspapers stacked to the ceilings. She talked to herself, and to the cats, in a voice that still carried, faintly, somewhere under Connecticut, the American South. Children dared each other toward her fence. Now and then she'd appear at a neighbor's door for milk, or not be seen at all for weeks. The school did something schools don't get enough credit for. It adopted her, quietly. Boys were sent around to cut her firewood, clear her path, bring food across from the kitchens. Masters kept a distant eye. For years, the last practical tether between Florence Maybrick and the human race was a rotation of teenage boys with an armload of stove wood, being polite to a strange old woman on her sagging porch, having no idea, none, that the little hand taking the bread had once gripped the dock rail at St. George's Hall, while a courtroom full of men decided whether to break her neck. A few adults did know. That's the detail I can't get over. At some point, her identity slipped, the way identities do, to a small handful of townspeople, and hear this story, which has been one institutional betrayal after another for 2 hours, finally shows you the other thing people can do with a secret. They kept it. For years, nobody sold her to a newspaper. Nobody made her a local attraction. The town simply decided, without a meeting, that the Catwoman had been Mrs. Chandler when she moved in, and would go on being Mrs. Chandler, and the 20th century, which owed her that much, was finally made to pay a little of it. On the 23rd of October 1941, she didn't appear, and someone went to check, and in the little cottage among the cats and the stacked newspapers, Florence Maybrick was found dead. She was 79. She had outlived the husband by 52 years, the judge by 47, the queen by 40, the century that convicted her by 4 decades, and every single principle of her trial. The papers found in the cottage settled beyond argument who she was, and the town's held secret went loud around the world one last time. The Catwoman of the Connecticut woods was the Maybrick woman. Front pages, all over again. 1889's most famous prisoner, dying under a false name, with, when everything was totted up, an estate worth next to nothing. They buried her where she had asked to be buried, and I'd rather end a sentence on this fact than almost any other in the case. Not in Liverpool, nowhere near the Maybrick vault where James lies. She was laid in the grounds of South Kent School, beside her friend Clara Doolan, one of the few human beings of her last years she had loved and trusted. A boys' school in Connecticut is the final resting place of the storm center of Victorian England, by her own request, next to a friend. After everything, she got to choose one thing, and she chose that. Before the verdict gets its ending, the dead man deserves his, because there's a question we've been circling for 2 hours that honesty requires us to face head-on. If the rope was wrong, what did kill James Maybrick? The historians and doctors who have retried this case across a century, and there have been many, with better toxicology than 1889 ever dreamed of, sort into 3 camps, and it's worth hearing all 3, because how you leave this story depends on which one you find yourself standing in. Camp 1 says, disease, full stop. Gastroenteritis, exactly as the defense experts testified, a savage gut inflammation in a run-down 50-year-old, worsened by the wedding at the races, and then by the medical carousel itself, a fortnight of Victorian prescriptions poured into a failing digestion. On this reading, the traces of arsenic in his organs are just the sediment of his habit, background radiation from 20 years of pick-me-ups, irrelevant to the death. No murder, no attempt that mattered, a natural death, dressed up as a crime by a hostile household. Camp 2 says James killed James. The self-doser, marooned in bed, feeling worse by the day, with a lifetime's private stash within reach, and a fixed belief that the cure for feeling bad was another dose. On this reading, some of what tortured his last fortnight he administered to himself, in secret, as he always had, and the great irony of St. George's Hall is that the poisoning the Crown proved traces of was real, and its author was in the coffin, not the dock. The 150 grains from Valentine Blake sit very comfortably in this camp. Camp 3 says her, or at least says her hand cannot be ruled out. The flypapers, the timing, the letter, the bottle. Serious writers have stayed in this camp, and intellectual honesty makes me tell you so. But notice what even Camp 3 concedes when it argues carefully. It argues she may have tried. It cannot get the dose into the body, because a century of rereading the analyst's figures hasn't changed them. Which is to say, the strongest modern case against Florence Maybrick is the Home Office's 1889 compromise, attempt suspected, murder unproven, and we have already spent tonight watching what that compromise is worth as a reason to take 15 years of a human life. 3 camps, 1 certainty. On the only question the jury was asked, did the Crown prove beyond reasonable doubt that this man died by arsenic at his wife's hand? The modern answer is broader and firmer than Russell ever got to argue. No. And with that settled, we can finally bury the verdict itself. So, the verdict. Somebody should finally say plainly what happened to it, because every other character in this story got an ending, and the verdict never did. It was never overturned. It is still, formally, the finding. In 1889, the Crown told the world, in 1 paragraph, that Florence Maybrick was a convicted murderer, and that her husband's death could not be shown to be a murder, and no English institution has ever cleaned up that paragraph. 3 years after she walked out of Aylesbury, in 1907, Parliament finally built the thing whose absence had nearly killed her, the Court of Criminal Appeal, and the scholars, who trace that court's origins point straight back through the file, marked Maybrick as one of the scandals that shamed it into existence. Every prisoner in England after 1907 had a road out of a bad verdict. The woman whose case helped pave the road never got to walk it. It was not built retroactive. The men did fine, for the record. Justice Stevens' reputation required a generation of polite footnotes. The Home Office's paragraph sits in the archives, uncorrected, a monument to the institutional instinct that would rather warehouse a woman for 15 years than write the words, "We got it wrong." Alfred Brierly took himself abroad and out of history. Michael Maybrick collected honors, served years as mayor of Ryde on his comfortable island, and was buried respectably, a famous man for his songs, until modern writers began turning over his role in this story, and, in one much-argued book, accused him of far worse things than managing a sister-in-law into a cell. Those are theories, and I'll leave them labeled as theories. With one true footnote you already have the key to. The book that accuses him took its title from one of Michael's own hit songs, the ballad I mentioned hours ago. They All Love Jack. History, as promised, has a sense of humor. It just isn't a kind one. Which brings us, because it always brings everyone, to the diary. In 1992, a scrapbook surfaced in Liverpool claiming to be the private confession of James Maybrick, and claiming that the arsenic-eating cotton broker of Battlecrease House had been, of all the things a document could claim, Jack the Ripper. It made the Maybrick name globally famous all over again, for exactly the wrong reason. I'm not spending our last minutes tonight relitigating it. The document surfaced a century late, through hands that changed their story about where it came from. Its defenders and debunkers have fought to a bloody standstill, and most serious students of the case treat it somewhere between unproven and manufactured. What matters for our story is simpler and sadder. Type the name Maybrick into the world today, and you'll be handed a probably fake mystery about the husband, stacked 10 deep, before you find one honest account of the fully documented thing that was done to the wife. The legend buried the record. It usually does. Strip the legend off, then, one last time, and look at what the record actually holds. A man who spent 2 decades eating arsenic died with less than a killing dose in him, of an illness his own doctors treated as disease, and his wife was condemned to hang for it in under an hour of deliberation, by a jury steered for 2 days by a failing judge who invited them to punish her adultery, in a legal system that gave her no voice and no appeal, and when the government's own review found the murder itself unproven, it did not free her, it resentenced her, in a back room, for a felony no jury ever heard argued, and called it mercy. 15 years. Her children never came back. Her son was killed by an accident of poison. Her name was killed by the state, and she buried the name herself in the Connecticut woods, and outlived them all, sustained at the end by cats, schoolboys, and a town that finally showed her what discretion was for. The half grain of arsenic in that little bottle on the washstand was real. She put it there, and she said so, and you can weigh her explanation however your conscience tells you. Here's what I keep coming back to, after all of it. The bottle was never drunk, the dose was never fatal, the murder was never proven. Only the woman was. England never took the verdict back. She stopped waiting for it to. Somewhere in her last October, among the wood smoke and the cats and the boys from the school hauling her winter logs, is the only acquittal Florence Maybrick ever received, and it was issued by a small town in Connecticut, unanimously, in silence. The record stays open. The cottage is gone. The school is still there, and so is the grave, beside her friend, under the trees, an ocean away from Liverpool. Case, such as it ever was, closed by time. Good night.